Hello and welcome to Emmy Live. I'm Mathilda Mallinson. It's Tuesday, the 28th of April, 2026. Today, a sacking at CBS News worth knowing about. A CBS sacking, a mass media takeover, and behind it all, a father and son billionaire duo courting the US president and Israel. Here's one more reason to worry about press freedom in America. CBS News just sacked its London bureau chief after she clashed with its new editor-in-chief, a self-described Zionist, over coverage of Gaza and Iran. Claire Day, who has worked at CBS for over 2 decades, reportedly pushed back against her boss Bari Weiss, who was installed in October by the incoming billionaire CEO David Ellison. We'll get to him. Claire Day's veteran work at CBS has been nominated for multiple Emmys. She was fired despite being officially cleared of bias after a freelancer accused her of running the London office like a Hamas cell, inside sources told the New York Post. Day's expected replacement, Shayndi Raice, is a Wall Street Journal editor currently based in Israel, whose portfolio shows no prior TV experience. Day's firing follows a string of layoffs at the network since Ellison's Skydance Media merged with Paramount in August. Ellison and his chosen editor-in-chief, Weiss, have faced pushback from staff and accusations of steering coverage in a more Trump-friendly direction. Last week, protesters targeted a dinner thrown by Ellison to honour the president, which was attended by Bari Weiss. If Ellison's goal is ingratiating himself with the president, he appears to be doing a pretty good job.
And by the way, David has done a very good job. David Ellison, he just had a very big win. It's a great family. Great family. Say hello to him, okay?
The dinner comes as Paramount's Skydance seeks federal approval for a $111 billion acquisition of Warner Bros. Discovery, despite widespread fears of potential media monopoly. Weeks before its merger with Paramount, Trump received a timely $16 million payout when Paramount chose to settle his lawsuit over a 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris, despite denying any wrongdoing. Trump himself said Ellison sweetened the deal by throwing in $20 million of additional pro-MAGA advertising. And one more thing, David Ellison's boss happens to be his father, the world's 6th richest man, Larry Ellison. Larry is close personal friends with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and has donated tens of millions to the Friends of the IDF, as well as funding an excavation in occupied Palestinian territory. To join me now for an autopsy of Western media coverage of Iran, Israel, and the wider Middle East is independent journalist and author of the Proximity newsletter, Barry Malone. Barry, welcome to Emmy Live. So CBS reportedly replacing its London bureau chief over Iran-Gaza coverage. Anything to say?
Yeah, it's the latest example of Bari Weiss destroying a 98-year-old news organization. Now, no matter what you might think of US mainstream media, CBS is a venerable old institution of US media. I mean, they have strings of achievements and massive stories that they've broken, consequential stories over the years. I mean, in 1932, famously, they broke the Lindbergh kidnappings live on air in 1932. You know, this is a place with achievements going back a really, really long way. And I can't recall of anyone managing to destroy a news organization so quickly. And, you know, when you look at the reporting around Claire Day and who she was, it seems like she's a very widely respected news journalist, you know, more than 20 years in the organization, respected by her colleagues, a good track record behind her, and seems to be very much cut from that kind of old CBS News cloth. And you know, people are talking about how she clashed with Bari Weiss or how she pushed back on calls. That is the sign of a healthy newsroom. If you're not in a newsroom where discussions are happening over how you cover a story, how you frame a story, the language that you use, the sources that you use, who you talk to, then, you know, that's not a very good newsroom. So it sounds to me like Claire Day has been fired for doing her job.
It's true. We often have pretty lively discussions here at the MEE newsroom. Let's talk more widely now about coverage of Iran in the West, in the international media. In a recent op-ed for MEE, you wrote, when it comes to covering Western adversaries, international media continue to do the bidding of Israel and the US. Could you just clarify who you mean by international media and tell us how exactly they are doing the US and Israel's bidding when it comes to Iran?
You want me to start pointing fingers? I'm happy to do so. I think in the last 2.5 years, we've seen such coverage from the BBC. We've seen coverage from the New York Times and many other organizations. But there I've called out probably the two most widely respected organizations in the Western media, the two places where, in my long career in journalism, I've often met people who are gunning to work there. That's where they want to get to. That's the pinnacle of their career. One day I'll work for the BBC, one day I'll work for the New York Times. But what we've seen with both of those organizations and other organizations, and this is not new, this goes back to the Iraq War and this goes back to before that, is that they frame coverage of Western adversaries very differently to how they frame coverage of Western allies. So you see small things in the framing that you need to be aware of. Iran is always a regime. Always. That term is only ever applied to countries that oppose Western governments or that do not have a close relationship with Western governments. Is it ever applied to, say, for example, Saudi Arabia? We can all criticize what happened in Saudi Arabia with the bone saw killing of Jamal Khashoggi. Do they ever refer to it as a regime? No, it's referred to as a country run by a reformist leader. And you can just see the double standards right there. They don't stop for a second often to examine themselves, the countries where they grew up in, the media that they consumed, and how that might have caused them to frame the world in a way that is not very journalistic.
It's true. At Middle East Eye, we're prohibited in our editorial guidelines from replacing the term government with regime. And it does make me wonder, how do other outlets decide when a government becomes a regime? But it's interesting because you point to, the BBC, which adheres to this steadfast policy of non-partisanship. And I think that we are often taught to assess media partisanship according to like a left-right spectrum, but not a West anti-Western geopolitical spectrum. Something else you also point out in your opinion piece, which I found really interesting, is how commonly these terms Iran-linked, Iran-backed, Iran-aligned have been used in current mainstream coverage of what's happening in the world at the moment as the US and Israel are waging war on Iran. Just tell us a little bit about why you think these terms are not very journalistic.
Well, again, it comes down to one of the key tenets of journalism is precise language. Now, that's whether you're writing a piece or whether you're putting together a TV package or whether you're interviewing somebody. I early in my career started working at Reuters, where it was drilled into us to consider every word. Every single word, and I'm not exaggerating about that, every single word that went into a 600-word piece was weighed up by an editor and thought about any way that we described a government or an armed group or a particular country. And what I found when I looked into the use of these terms, Iran-linked, Iran-affiliated, Iran-backed, was that they were reported with no sourcing. So again, what's happening is you see a key principle of journalism, which is to source contentious claims and to tell the audience how you know them, if possible, and to also tell the audience what you don't know. So I found some examples in BBC coverage. I found several examples in BBC coverage. I found some examples in Sky News coverage, and I found examples in other places. So what happens is, we had these attacks in in London, where the 3 ambulances were set on fire. The Jewish community run ambulances. And then we had a slew of articles that said an Iran-backed group has claimed responsibility, an Iran-linked group has claimed responsibility. Now, very, very little is known about that group. Very little. Even if you go and look at things that were written by sort of quote-unquote terrorism analysts, people who track such groups, people who write academic papers on these groups, even they admitted that they didn't know much about it. So how do we get to a place where BBC can then say in a headline, an Iran-linked group? And I think another thing that I said by the way, without quoting that to anyone or sourcing that to anyone, that's BBC saying that. If they put that in a headline with no quotation marks, that is BBC telling us.
Yeah, they're reporting
group
it as fact,
is
and the counter-terrorism
Exactly.
investigation is still underway. It is inconclusive whether this group is in fact linked to Iran.
Yeah, exactly. So you know that, right? You know that, Mathilda. You know, because that's an established fact. So why would the BBC not rely on established fact when it's reporting on this group? And the same with Sky News and the other examples that I found, because this is also really consequential stuff. You know, if there's an attack on a Jewish community-run ambulance service in London, and that's linked to Iran, that's a very, very consequential claim.
And why is it so Why is it so consequential? Why is it so important? These small editorial decisions, why are they so consequential in the bigger scheme of things?
Because there's an effort underway to manufacture consent to go to war with Iran. You know, and we saw that happening for months before the US and Israel launched the attack in Iran. I think the first time I wrote about this coverage was in Middle East. I was in January. You know, so we seen this build of coverage and briefing coming out of the US and Israeli governments, pushing for war in Iran and trying to come up with a pretext for war in Iran. And that's the other thing. When you look at the facts of why the US and Israel went to war with Iran, one thing that they often cite is the nuclear program. Again, with the reporting, there is no evidence that Iran was an imminent threat to the US. There is no evidence that Iran was imminently going to develop a nuclear weapon. A year before, we had the 12-day war, in which Donald Trump said that Iran's ability to use a nuclear weapon had been quote unquote obliterated. And then very recently we had the US head of counterterrorism, sorry, I'm Tulsi Gabbard, say in front of a Senate hearing that Iran hadn't rebuilt the capability that it had before the 12-day war, but that it hadn't even sought to rebuild that capability. Yet we're told that that was the reason that the US and Israel attacked Iran. The role of the media is to interrogate that. And again, I'm a former news journalist. I'm not working as a hard news journalist right now. And I know these things. And I know these things just from consuming the media. So I would expect more from reporters.
Yeah. And is it just about geopolitical consequences? You know, is it just about how Western audiences are directed to see geopolitical events, to see foreign governments? Or do you think that these editorial choices materially impact how Western audiences see ordinary civilians in these countries as well?
Absolutely. And I think I also wrote a piece that covered this in Middle East Eye recently, which is humanization. You know, we see the Western media humanize victims of war when they're white. We see them humanize victims of war when they're Western. And we also see them humanize victims of war when they're Western adjacent. We see them humanize Israeli victims of war. But what we don't often see is them humanize Arab victims of war, African victims of war, Palestinian victims of war, Sudanese victims of war. And, you know, I think what I wrote as well is that, let me give you an example. When Iran is covered, a website, say BBC, because I've seen them do this, has to make a decision about how to illustrate that story. So they go into the archive, they look through their images, they look at what Reuters has available, AP has available, Getty has available, and they pick an image that they think best illustrates the story. How many times have you gone to the BBC website or the New York Times website, and it's a random piece about Iranian politics, and the image used is a woman in an abaya walking past some graffiti, a mural in Iran that depicts the US as the Great Satan, or that has the Statue of Liberty with a skull for a face? What is that telling a Western audience? That's telling a Western audience, these people are not like you, these people hate you. And so again, what you're doing is you're implicitly telling the audience that the Iranian people are not worthy of your sympathy. And what we seen a couple of weeks ago was these sort of images of Iranians. Now, these are affluent Iranians in northern Tehran who are going to these kind of hipster coffee shops. And it was crazy to see sort of people on social in the US and in the UK shocked. This is Iran? They're drinking coffee? They're walking dogs? They do yoga? You know, and I think that just showed how powerful the non-humanization or the lack of attempt to humanize people from the Middle East and African countries in times of war is. That shock shows that they had never consumed coverage like that before, that they never understood the nuance of society in Iran, which is an incredibly complex country of 93 million people, with devout people and secular people and religious cities and non-religious cities and people who wear the hijab and people who don't want to wear the hijab. We don't hear that in the Western media.
And presumably, Iran isn't the only Western adversary that, in your eyes, suffers this treatment at the hands of international media.
Yeah, you know, I think we see it a lot. Or let me give you an extreme example. We always see it with North Korea, where Kim Jong-un is habitually portrayed as a sort of a bumbling head of, you know, an autocratic dictatorship, and everything that he says in, you know, with regard to geopolitics is to be sort of laughed at and sneered at. I read what Kim Jong-un says. He will put out a statement. Say he did one recently on geopolitics, in which he, and by the way, this is not me defending Kim Jong-un or the way that he runs North Korea. This is me dissecting media coverage. He put out he made a speech where he talked about the US and Israel as a threat to global stability. It was a long speech, and there was a lot of good stuff in it. There were a lot of statements in there that you would agree with. A lot of them were quite eloquent. But the bits that were pulled out of that statement were the bits that made him sound unhinged, the bits that made him sound crazy. And it's so apparent when you look at the full content that is available to the Western media and the decisions that they make when it comes to covering those countries.
Mm. That's really, really interesting. North Korea as an example, actually, probably the starkest example. But when you put it like that, it is quite difficult to argue with. I suppose an example that's been much more heavily analysed is Western media coverage of Gaza. And you talk about this yourself in one of the opinion pieces. You point to this clip from BBC Newsnight that we just want to play to audiences. This is from an interview between presenter Kirsty Walk and Hussam Zomlot, who was head of the Palestinian mission to Britain and who had just found out that 7 members of his family had been killed in the first day of the Israeli war on Gaza.
My cousin, Aya, her 2 children, her husband, her mother-in-law, and 2 other relatives died immediately, were killed instantly. And 2 of her youngest children, a twin, 2 years old, are now in intensive care. This is truly heartbreaking. And the issue here, Kirsty, is that they have no bunkers, they have no Iron Dome, they have nowhere to go. They are simply sitting ducks for the Israeli war machine.
I'm sorry for your own personal loss. I mean, can I just be clear, though? You cannot condone the killing of civilians in Israel, can you? Nor the kidnapping of families.
No, we don't condone.
Now, for context, this is October the 9th, so this is 2 days after the Hamas-led attack in Israeli, or on Israeli civilians as well as soldiers. But why do you think it's wrong for the presenter to ask this question in this moment?
Well, also by October the 9th, I think we were already up to 600 people killed in Gaza, and many of those people were children, and we just learned that some of them were in Hussam Zomlot's family. I think that is one of the most egregious things that I have ever seen in the media anywhere in the world. Look, you can ask the question, but Hussam Zomlot was not there to defend Hamas. He represents the Palestinian Authority. And what it showed, listen to the way that she poses the question, but you can't defend though you can't defend. He had never defended in the first place. It was a question that asked him to prove his humanity, is how I look at it. It says, tell us, are you the good kind of Palestinian or are you the bad kind of Palestinian? If you condemn Hamas, we're interested in talking to you. You can be the good kind of Palestinian. If you have a more nuanced take, I'm sorry, you're the bad Palestinian and we must condemn you. And what we saw beginning from then and running all the way through the 2.5 years of the genocide is Palestinians and Arab guests and just, pro-Palestinian guests, anti-genocide guests being asked again and again and again to condemn Hamas, being asked again and again and again to prove their humanity. No matter what happens on the Israeli side, no matter what Israel does, kills children, admits that it hunts down and targets journalists, any atrocity that's committed, have you ever seen an Israeli guest being asked to throat clear in the way that Palestinian guests are and condemn an Israeli action in Gaza? I never, ever have. And in that moment, just the lack of humanity that she showed him was remarkable to me, because Kirsty Wark was more interested in that moment about ticking that box, because she knew that if she didn't tick that little box and ask him to condemn Hamas, that she would be assailed by the Israeli lobby, that she'd probably have a problem with their bosses. So in that moment, that overrode her own humanity towards somebody who was telling her that members of his family had just been killed. I find it remarkable, and I think that it's only applied to, or most often applied to Palestinians.
Barry Malone, thank you so much for your time. It's been really quite thought-provoking speaking to you. And for anyone watching who agrees, I encourage you to go and read Barry's pieces online at www.middleeasteye.net. Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure you're following us on social media at Middle East Eye. You can email MEElive@middleeasteye.net. Hit subscribe to stay on top of all of our coverage.